we study Revelation chapter 18. I'm going to pull up that roadmap that we have seen over and over in the class. Gives you where we are in the book of Revelation. Of course, you're gonna hate to hear this again from me, but you're gonna hear it now. You're gonna hear it 3 more times. So I'm gonna emphasize in every class that Revelation breaks up into 2 halves. You have chapters 1 through 11. That's the first half of the book of Revelation. You have chapters 12 through 22. That's the second half of the book of Revelation. Both halves of the book of Revelation tell the same story. The only difference is that the first half tells the story from the earthly perspective. The second half tells the story from the spiritual background, or looking at the deeper spiritual background, if you will, but the same story told twice. So that's where we are this evening. We're in the second half of the book of Revelation. Very specifically, we find ourselves in chapter 18, where we are continuing an examination of the prostitute, the scarlet beast, the fall of Babylon. And that's going to continue on into chapter 19. We're not going to look at 19 verses 1 through 10 tonight. We're going to look at that Wednesday night. But that's where we are. And as I've indicated, we are very much drawing to the conclusion of the book of Revelation. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the text itself, looking at Revelation chapter 18. It is 24 verses long, and I'm going to apologize up front. I've got a little bit of a frog in my throat. Allergies have just really kicked in for some reason over the last week or so. And so if I cough and clear my throat a little bit, that's all that is. So I'll try not to do that terribly much. But as we look at chapter 18, there are 24 verses, and so we're going to break this down into smaller sections and look at that individually. And the first section that we've got in chapter 18 is that we have a message. We have a message from an angel, verses 1 through 3. You know, if you go through the book of Revelation, you've got lots of angels. In fact, it is impossible to number the angels that are found in the book of Revelation. Now, we could probably put a number on those that actually speak and those that actually do something concretely, specifically, as opposed to all the others. But we have angels throughout the book of Revelation. As a matter of fact, I would dare say that we find more angels in the book of Revelation than the entire rest of the Bible. All of the New Testament, all of the Old Testament together, probably all the occurrences of angels that we have, we go all the way back to the patriarchal period. If we were to add all those up, I'm really not sure that we would find more in all of those books than we find in the book of Revelation. We have lots of angels, and so here we have yet another angel with a message. Let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 3. After this, I saw, this is John speaking. He said, after this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. So the angel brings this message, and if we were to write that message, if we were to shorten it and say it in 3 words, that message would be that Babylon is fallen. Now we look at that statement that's made there, and what we also need to understand is that that has already been expressed in Revelation chapter 14 and verse 8. Go ahead and just hold your spot there in Revelation 18, but look with me, if you would, over in Revelation chapter 14 and verse 8. Another angel, this is Revelation chapter 14 and verse 8, another angel, a second, followed, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. This language, this statement that's made here is very much, pretty much identical, but in a shortened form of what we find in Revelation chapter 18, verses 1 through 3. We might note in regards to that, Isaiah chapter 21 and verse 9. So go ahead and take your Bibles to the Old Testament. Go to Isaiah chapter 21 and verse 9. We're going to find ourselves a lot this evening in the Old Testament prophets. In Isaiah chapter 21 and verse 9, this is what we read. And behold, here come riders, horsemen in pairs, And he answered, Fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the carved images of her gods he has shattered to the ground. So we have this statement in Isaiah talking about the fall of Babylon. Same language being used in Revelation chapter 14 and verse 8. Same language being used in Revelation chapter 18 verses 1 through 3. What we need to note about this is that when the angel gives this message, when John sees this vision, Babylon, which is Rome, Babylon has not yet fallen. But here in this vision, the decree is made. Judgment is passed, if you will. Judgment has been pronounced on the city of Rome, on the Roman Empire. And although she hasn't actually fallen yet, it is as if she already has. So we should not look at this text here in Revelation and say, well, did Rome fall in 96 AD? No, it did not. But what's being said here is that in this vision, it is God's pronouncement of judgment. It is as if it has already happened. It is absolutely certain and absolutely sure. All right, so we look at this language that's used here in these first 3 verses. There it is, a description here of the desolation that comes upon Babylon upon Rome. It's Babylon. It's called Babylon in Revelation, but it's Rome, upon that city, upon that empire. What's interesting as we look at that is that this is language that we also find in the Old Testament. So again, looking at these verses here, chapter 18, verse 2, she has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. The picture here is one of desolation. The animals move back in. Nobody's living there. Well, when we see that language, it should remind us of the Old Testament, of some texts that we find. We find these particularly in the book of Isaiah. So we're going to look at 2. Look with me, if you would, at Isaiah chapter 13. Isaiah chapter 13 and verse 21. Isaiah chapter 13 and verse 21. I pulled up too many points there. Let's try that again. Isaiah chapter 13 and verse 21. Notice what's said here. And Isaiah 13 is talking about literal Babylon. But wild animals will lie down there, and their houses will be full of howling creatures. Their ostriches will dwell, and their wild goats will dance. And you could continue on. Verse 22 talks about hyenas and jackals. The point of that is that Babylon is going to lay desolate, and it's going to be like a place for animals to go in and live. We see the language also used in Isaiah chapter 34. Now I'll go ahead and pull up that point in reference to Edom. Isaiah chapter 34 and verse 14. And wild animals shall meet with hyenas. The wild goat shall cry to his fellow. Indeed, there the night bird settles and finds for herself a resting place. And again, you can continue on reading farther here, talking about these animals that move into Edom, this desolation, this language that's used there. What's going on here is that in the Holy Spirit inspiring John to see this vision and writing this down, his writers, who would have been very familiar with Old Testament prophecy, would have immediately equated in their minds what they're reading here in the book of Revelation with what they already knew from the book of Isaiah in regards to Babylon and Edom. So Rome is going to end up just like those powers of the Old Testament. That's what we're meant to understand. The image here in verses 1 through 3 then continues, because we get then in verse 3, go ahead and go back to Revelation 18 and verse 3. Turn over there in my Bible as well. Revelation 18 and verse 3, we get language again that we already saw in chapter 17. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. The kings of the earth have committed immorality with her. The merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. So the image of a harlot here is once again, that was the image of chapter 17. We had the harlot, the prostitute, on the scarlet beast. Here in chapter 18, we have the same language that's being used now in reference to Babylon. So what we are supposed to understand is that Babylon here in Revelation chapter 18 represents the same thing that's going on in chapter 17, where we have the prostitute and the scarlet beast. They are one and the same. And in the book of Revelation, we're talking about Rome and the Roman Empire. That's verses 1 through 3. Let's go ahead and continue on then in the chapter. Looking farther into this, let's go ahead and read the next section, which is verses 4 through 8. We get a message here from heaven. Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues, for her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back as she herself has paid back others, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she mixed, and she glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning. Since in her heart she says, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. These verses here, verses 4 through 8, it is a message from heaven, but it is a message specifically directed now to the saints. And the message to them, the message to these Christians is, come out of her, my people. Now the saints here, in these 7 churches in Asia, the Christians as a whole in the first century that are receiving the book of Revelation, they can't literally do that. I mean, I guess they could move to the borders of the empire and actually leave the empire, but that isn't what God is calling upon them to do. God is calling upon them to remain sanctified. They are living in an evil, wicked society. They are living in a society where people are interested in pursuing pleasure. People are interested in all sorts of pleasure, the vast majority of which were sinful pleasures. And so society is running after those things. Now God, in the middle of this, stops and says, you need to remain holy. You need to remain sanctified. You need to come out of her. It's not a literal coming out of her. They're not physically removing themselves from Rome. They are coming out of her in terms of their outlook, in terms of the way they live, in terms of the things that they're doing. We might note in connection with this 2 passages, one in the Old Testament, one in the New. Let's go to the Old Testament first. I guess I should have told you at the beginning of the class, put a bookmark in Isaiah because we're going to be there a lot this evening, and we are there in Jeremiah. But let's go ahead and look at Isaiah chapter 48. Isaiah chapter 48 and verse 20. Notice what's said here. Go out from Babylon, flee from Chaldea. Declare this with a shout of joy. Proclaim it. Send it out to the end of the earth. Say, the Lord has redeemed his servant Jacob. There was a literal sense in which the people of Israel eventually came out of Babylon. They were eventually free to go back to their home when the Persians take over. So there's a literal sense that that's true. But I don't think that that's the entirety of the sense here in Isaiah chapter 48. Instead, part of what's going on, maybe even the majority of what's going on here, is that these Jews that are now in captive Babylon need to remember who they are. They need to remember who God is. They need to remember God's law. They need to come out of Babylon. Look with me in the New Testament. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 17. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 17. This is a text that is directed specifically at Christians. Notice what's said here in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 17. Actually, let's go ahead and pick up verse 16 and read that. What agreement has the temple of God? This is 2 Corinthians chapter 6, we're in verse 16. What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, as God said. I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now here's the conclusion, verse 17. Therefore go out from their midst, and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing, and I will welcome you. The Christians in Corinth are getting the same message that we see here in the book of Revelation, and that is that they are to be different. They are to come out from that world around them. You know, the world calls strongly to us. The world tries to get us to come and be like they are. God calls to us and says, don't you do it. Remain sanctified. Remain separate. Now, the message that comes from heaven, the speaker here is not identified. Earlier, we saw the angel. This time, we just get a voice from heaven. The speaker is not identified. It is, however, possibly Christ the Lamb. Or it could be God the Father. I'm not going to quibble with you on that. I wouldn't quibble with anybody on that because the text isn't specific. It's not identified. Doesn't seem to be the angel because the angel has finished his message. Then we get this other voice that comes from heaven. Possibly who we're looking at here is Christ or the Father on the throne. But it ultimately is definitely a message from God. All right, looking on at these verses here, verses 4 through 8, we also get in verse 6 the statement that God will repay Rome for her sins, even double for her deeds. So God is going to execute punishment that is going to go beyond just what Rome did, because Rome needs to be punished. Rome needs to judge. And so God says, that's what I'm going to do. Okay? It's going to be more than just the normal punishment. You know, when I was growing up, my parents are in the study with us here this evening. But when I was growing up, my mom didn't hesitate to spank us kids. But I knew that if I got in trouble with Mom during the day, there was no way Dad was not going to know about that. And when Dad came home, there was another judgment coming. So whatever I did, I could almost always count on getting punished double for that deed. That's kind of what's going on here with Rome. It's extra punishment, if you will. We also note here in these verses, in verse 7, a statement of Rome's, let me see if I can get that to come up, of Rome's arrogance. Look at verse 7 again with me, if you will. Go back to Revelation chapter 18. Revelation chapter 18 and verse 7. Notice again what she says here at the end of the verse. Verse 7, the very end. I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. That's Rome's arrogance. Who could possibly touch us? We are the greatest. I think about the boxer Muhammad Ali. He said, I am the greatest. And maybe he was the greatest. That's a little bit like what you got here with Rome. Rome says, I am the greatest. I sit as a queen. I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. So in spite of all these things that are going on, the arrogance just continues. Look with me again to the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 47 and verses 5 through 9. Isaiah chapter 47, I should say, verses 5 through 9. Notice what we read here. Sit in silence. This is Isaiah 47, starting in verse 5. Sit in silence, go into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you shall no more be called the mistress of kingdoms. I was angry with my people. I profaned my heritage. I gave them into your hand. You showed them no mercy. On the aged you made your yoke exceedingly heavy. This is talking about Babylon having punished Judah. And God says why that happened. Verse 7, you said, I shall be mistress forever, so that you did not lay these things to heart or remember their end. Now therefore hear this, you lover of pleasures, who sit securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. I shall not sit as a widow or know the loss of children. These two things shall come to you in a moment, and one day the loss of children and widowhood shall come upon you in full measure, in spite of your many sorceries and the great power of your enchantment. So again, the language that's in Revelation is being pulled straight out of the book of Isaiah in texts that are talking about Babylon, but in Revelation they're talking about spiritual Babylon, which is the city of Rome and the Roman Empire. All right, so let's continue looking in Revelation chapter 18. So go ahead and go back, if you would, to Revelation chapter 18. We're going to be now starting in verse 9, and we're going to go all the way down to the end of the chapter. So, I'm sorry, not to the end of the chapter, almost to the end of the chapter. How about that? Revelation chapter 18 and verse 9. Let's read the text. And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They shall stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold and silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, and sheep, horses and chariots and slaves, that is, human souls. The fruit for which your soul longed is gone from you, and all your delicacy and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. The merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas for the great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. For in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste. And all shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea, stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? They threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, Alas, alas, for the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For in a single hour she has been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. All right, as we're looking at this text, it was a lengthy text. We read the whole thing. There are certain parallels here to Ezekiel chapter 27 and 28. We do not have time to read that this evening in this class, but you might jot that down and go back and look at that at your own leisure. But Ezekiel chapter 27 and verse 20 and chapter 28 are talking about the destruction of Tyre, and there are clear certain parallels, I should say, between this text and the text that we just read in Revelation. But there are some groups here that are pictured and how they react to what's going on with the city. So we have the kings. These are these client kings, those that were under Rome's control. In this particular case, they're weeping and wailing over Rome's fall as they are in fear of her torment. What happens to Rome? What happens there is going to spread and hurt us as well. So when they see Rome falling, they're in fear of that torment. Those are the kings. We have a second group. This time we have the merchants. We've read all this text. We're not going to go back and read that. But the merchants here are weeping and mourning over Rome's fall because there's not going to be anyone to buy their cargo. There is a whole listing here in these verses of all of these incredible, precious items that are being brought into the city of Rome, that are being sold there. Rome is importing all of these things. They're importing from other parts of the empire. They're importing from Africa. They're importing from India. They're importing from Arabia, things that are luxury items. We might look at that list, and in our standards today, we might say, well, we don't think those are very luxurious at all. We don't really care about most of that stuff. But in the ancient world in Rome, this was a mark of luxury. So all these cargoes are being brought in. Merchants are making their money off of being able to bring these things into Rome. You know, buy low, sell high. That's the way that works. It worked in the ancient world as well. So they're buying these things and they're bringing them to Rome, and Rome is buying them, and the merchants themselves are getting wealthy from that. And so when they see what's happening with Rome, they realize their business interests are going to take a hit. Something else that's here in the text that's listed here is in the New American Standard, it says, and slaves and human lives. And if New King James Version says, and bodies and souls of men. Let's go back up. Let's see if I can find it in the ESV. That's in verse 13. And slaves, that is, human souls. And so they get a little bit, they translate a little bit differently in these three translations. There is an apparent linking of the idioms for slaves in both Greek and Hebrew. So in all of these luxury items, what we also need to understand is that these merchants are making their money off human cargoes as well. They're bringing slaves up to Rome to be sold. Okay, I have a question here. I'm going to deal with that just a second, Mary. Let me go ahead and finish the last point on this slide, and then I'll go ahead and address that question. They're also in fear of her torment and the sudden loss of her wealth, verses 15 through 17. Okay, so Mary asked the question. Those of you who are not seeing the comments, I need to read this out loud to you. What is the significance of the term in a single hour? It is repeated throughout the chapter. Mary, I am glad you picked up on that. Hopefully, as we were reading those texts in the Old Testament, you picked up on it there as well, because we also see that in use with Babylon. I think that what I think is going on there is it's simply what's saying punishment has been decreed, and when punishment comes upon them, it's going to be very swift. The problem comes for us when we try to pinpoint, well, where exactly and when exactly did God execute judgment on Rome? The answer to that would be there are a series of events where God is executing judgment on the Roman Empire, and so trying to assign this one as opposed to this one over here is pretty much an exercise, in my mind at any rate, an exercise in futility. I think what the text is emphasizing is this has been decreed, this is going to happen, look for it, God is going to do this. I think that's the significance of that phrase that is repeated several times in a single hour. I do not think that it is meant to be taken literally, that in a literal 60-minute period, God is going to accomplish all of this. Okay? Maybe it is, but that's not how I would understand that here in the context of Revelation. Good question, Mary. Thank you for writing that in the comments and giving that to us this evening. All right, let's continue on. We're still looking at the reaction of man. We had the kings, we had the merchants. Now we have the seafarers. These are those that are involved with the sea, whether they be shipmasters or sailors, whoever it is that's making their money off running ships on the sea. It's a little bit similar to the merchants, but not exactly, because merchants can bring their goods in not just by the ocean. These seafarers are going to weep and mourn as well because of the loss of income caused by her fall. What we need to remember is that in the first century, in the ancient world, the Mediterranean Ocean had become a Roman lake. Now, obviously, it's not really a lake. It's an ocean. It's very, very large. But in the ancient world, you would have different powers that would exercise dominion over different parts of the Mediterranean. You had pirates as well in the ancient world. The Romans came along and they stopped all that. First of all, they controlled every land around the Mediterranean. So it was, except for where it goes out in the Atlantic Ocean, it was all Roman land around the Mediterranean. And they suppressed all those pirates. So the result of that being that these seafarers were able to move fairly easily in the Mediterranean without having to worry about their cargo being stolen by pirates or having their cargo taxed because they went into a foreign port or something to that extent. So the seafarers are going to be at a loss for this as well, because when Rome falls, it's going to go back to the old ways. The pirates are going to come out of the woodwork. Different nations are going to control different parts. It's going to be a loss of livelihood for them. But notice, if you will, that when you look at the kings, when you look at the merchants, when you look at the seafarers, they are all concerned about Rome's fall because of how it is going to hurt them specifically. They're not concerned about the fact that Rome is falling because Rome is wicked. They're concerned about Rome falling because it's going to hit them in the wallet. Attitudes today are not any different than what attitudes were in the ancient world. People have always been concerned primarily about themselves. People have always been primarily concerned about their own economic interests. All right, that's down to verse 19. Then we have verse 20. Now, if you have an ESV, go ahead and go back to Revelation 18. You should already be there because we didn't leave it. But if you have an ESV, verse 20 looks like it's immediately attached to 19, that it's the same speaker. But I would suggest to you that as you look at this, you have the seafarers crying out, verse 19, "Alas, alas for the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth, for in a single hour she has been laid waste." To me, there's a shift in verse 20, because in verse 20 it says, "Rejoice over her, O heaven." Okay, that's not the seafarers talking. "Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her." So it's no longer the cry of the seafarers, but it's probably a shift back to that speaker who is introduced in verse 4. There is rejoicing over God's judgment in favor of his saints, apostles, and prophets. And see, if you're looking for typos, there's one right there, and I caught it before you did. It should be in favor of his saints, apostles, and prophets. I don't know how many of y'all like to watch the TV shows that are court shows, but I occasionally like to watch Judge Judy, and I got to tell you, some of the things she says, she renders judgment. I mean, she doesn't even listen to the other person's argument, because she can just tell right off the bat within the first few words that argument is completely false, and she knows how she's going to rule based on what the other person had said. She rules in favor of the one who has been wronged or the one who is in the right in the lawsuit. God is executing judgment in favor of his saints. It's like you've got a court case between Rome and between the church. And Rome is battling against the church, and there's this cosmic court scene, and God renders judgment in favor of his saints, and that judgment is executed when Rome falls. And so the result of that for the saints, the apostles, the prophets, for the church of God, is to rejoice. Verse 20. Sometimes we as Christians get a little bit uncomfortable with some of the things that are said in the book of Revelation. We get uncomfortable with the fifth seal back in the first half of the book of Revelation, where the souls in the altar cry out and say, "How long, God, before you avenge our blood?" Because vengeance is something we're not particularly comfortable with. We have an attitude sometimes that really there shouldn't be any vengeance and there really shouldn't be any judgment. The book of Revelation says there is a place for vengeance and judgment. Vengeance belongs to God, make no mistake. But there is definitely a response of the saints that have been persecuted, that have been killed, that have been waiting for God to make things right. There is a place for their rejoicing when God does exactly that. I suspect that part of the reason why we as modern Christians today in the United States are a little bit uncomfortable with that language is because we have never been persecuted. We have never gone to church on Sunday morning, look around and say, "Well, where's Brother Smith?" Well, didn't you hear? Brother Smith got taken to the arena yesterday and got fed the lions. Oh, we've never lived with that. We've never lived with our boss coming into our office and saying, "Oh, so, Brother Jones," no, he wouldn't say Brother Jones, "Mr. Jones, I hear you're a Christian, and you're not going to go down and worship our pagan God with us. So, Mr. Jones, here's your pink slip. Go find another job." We've never lived with any of that here in the United States, and so maybe for us that language is a little bit uncomfortable. But for Christians living in the first century, there was most definitely a place for rejoicing when God executed judgment. Not just from the vengeance standpoint, but also from the standpoint that God is vindicating his cause. God is just. God is righteous. In God there is no evil at all. And so when God comes up against this earthly power that is wicked, and behind that earthly power is Satan, and God executes judgment, we should rejoice that God's cause is vindicated. All right, we've got a little bit more in the chapter, and we're running out of time, so let me go ahead and pull up our last slide. Let's go ahead and read verses 21 through 24. Then a mighty angel, I guess I'll pull up where we are so you see that. Verses 21 through 24. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, "So will Babylon the great city, be thrown down with violence and will be found no more. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more. And a craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more. And the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. And the light of a lamp will shine in you no more. And the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints, and of all who have been slain on earth." All right, so we get this proclamation from the mighty angel. It is that Babylon will fall. It is as if it has already happened, but again, it is still future for the readers. The language that is used here is heavily drawn from the Old Testament prophets. And if you've got a notepad and you want to write these down, go ahead as I pull them up because we don't have time to read them all together this evening. But we have in Isaiah chapter 24 and verse 8, a statement of universal judgment, same kind of language being used. In Ezekiel chapter 26 and verse 13, we have language again, this idea of no more music, no more laughter, no bride and groom, the mill's not going to be heard. Just collectively those things found in a message against the city of Tyre. Jeremiah 7:34, 16 in verse 9, 25 in verse 10. All of those are texts that are directed against Jerusalem and Judah, same kind of thing. Not going to have music and mirth and dancing and laughter. It's not going to be there anymore when God executes judgment. But then you get to Jeremiah 33, and this one we're going to read. Jeremiah chapter 33, when Judah is restored, notice what in Jeremiah chapter 33, verses 10 and 11 we read. "Thus says the Lord, in this place of which you say, it is a waste without man or beast, in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem that are desolate, without man or inhabitant or beast, there shall be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the voices of those who sing as they bring thank offerings to the house of the Lord. Give thanks to the Lord of hosts, For the Lord is good, and his steadfast love endures forever. For I will restore the fortunes of the land as at first, says the Lord. So in Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, directed against universal nations, but Tyre and Jerusalem, God's going to take these things away. God's going to take happiness away. But when Judah's restored, he gives those things back. Now, what's interesting in this, and I want you to kind of hold this because we're going to get to it, is that when we get into the last part of the book of Revelation, in the chapters that are coming, we're going to have this incredible depiction of heaven. And it will stand in contrast to a Rome where the wild animals run about, where there's no music, where there's no bride, no bridegroom. That's a place of despair. The description of heaven is going to be a place of absolute, total, and complete joy. That's still coming in the book of Revelation. We'll get to that soon. All right, verse 24 here in the chapter. We're not going to have time to read this as well. Very similar to Jesus' words against Jerusalem, found in Matthew chapter 23, verses 29 through 36. What I want to impress upon you is that as we see this language in the book of Revelation, he is pulling it. It's by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and it is a vision that John sees, but it is being pulled straight out of the Old Testament prophets. And so it is good for us to be familiar with those Old Testament texts to understand where this is coming from. All right, that's the end of chapter 18. I need to give you your assignment for Wednesday night. For Wednesday night, I need you to read chapter 19. Okay, chapter 19, verses 1 through 21 is what we're going to be talking about. And then we just have a couple of chapters after that, 20, 21, and 22, and the class is going to be finished.